Okay, Amy, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Awesome, we can hear you. So even more important. So, excellent. Well, why don't we get started? Thank you all very much for your great questions last session. We're turning to questions of communication and climate change, and I'm thrilled that we have two outstanding speakers for this. Online and kicking off, we have Dr. Amy Chadwick. Amy is the Barbara Geralds Schoonover Professor of Health. Her specialty is exactly what we're talking about in terms of communication around health and environment, and particularly climate change. She is directly affiliated with the various efforts on campus through the Communications and Development Master's program. Those of you talking to Felipe yesterday, a program that he's in, and working on these issues domestically and internationally, and have had the good fortune of collaborating with her on some climate change and domestic work. And so it's really a thrill that she's able to join us and kick off. And then she and I have had the good fortune of working with our second speaker, Azmat Kahn, who you met because he's been able to participate in multiple parts of this week. Azmat from Pakistan is studying how climate change is communicated and covered in Pakistan. And so looking at it in terms of that larger kind of journalism and communications perspective as well. We've been, Dr. Chadwick and I have been both lucky to have him in our class. And those of you who are professors will know when you have those kinds of students in the classroom, it's like you have an extra teacher. And so it's been fantastic to get to know Azmat and learn from his expertise as part of his dissertation committee and also in the classroom. So Dr. Chadwick, I'll turn it over to you, and then we will, Azmat, I think, has some good ideas to make it even easier for you and the audience to be heard by the folks online, by Amy online in terms of the questions. But we'll be sure to restate it if you can't hear what's being said from the floor, Amy, so that you get the full benefit of those interventions too. So we'll turn it over to you. We can see your screen. So over to you, Dr. Chadwick.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. DeVelco, for that welcome. I sincerely wish I could be with you all in person, but I'm glad I can be with you all virtually. And if you do have questions while I'm talking, feel free to sort of flag Dr. DeBelco or Azmat and let them know. And it's fine if you need to interrupt me to ask for a clarification question. So I'm going to focus on climate change communication. And I want to first say that climate change communication is a young, white, and very US European-centric field. It really started in the mid-1990s with a focus on public understanding of climate change. So what does the public understand about what scientists and the government are communicating? And what do they understand about their risk? What's the risk of climate change? Most of the research and most of the published work, with the exception of climate justice and climate advocacy, most of the scholars are white. Most of the climate change communication research is dominantly US and European based. And the reason that I want to tell you this is, one, there's probably many really great researchers in your countries as well as yourselves. And so your contributions would be fantastic to this field. But I also want to make sure you understand this because a lot of what we know about climate change communication is from US European backgrounds. And so this, whether or not it holds true in other countries, is an open question. Now, most of what I'm talking about today are lessons that can be drawn from health and environmental communication, which have a much longer, much more diverse history, much more diverse researchers, lots more, a variety of countries that have worked in this. So I wanted to put a caveat about what we know about climate change communication specifically, but what I'm talking about today are lessons that are drawn much more broadly and are applicable to a variety of different contexts. So climate change communication is a super broad field. So I just put down some of the various things that are included in the field. And I realized I had not shared a resource with you all. So I will share a resource with you all that gives you a background on climate change communication after this meeting. And today I'm going to talk just about a small part of this, and then Azmat is going to talk more about the words we use and the effect of the words we use. So I want to talk with you about social construction, framing theory, risk communication, and emotion, and give you some sort of lessons learned and tips for communicating about climate change. So the theory of social construction says people assign meaning through language. So how we talk about something or what we don't talk about defines the reality of an issue. For example, we often talk about climate change as a global problem. We often talk about climate change as a problem that policymakers need to address, which is true. It is a global problem. Policymakers need to do something about it. However, if we define climate change as a global problem, then there's nothing really for somebody locally to do, right? There's nothing for an individual to do. There's nothing for a community, a non-governmental organization to do. So the way that we define climate change, as well as its solutions, creates a reality. And that reality that we create determines what we see as a problem, as well as what we see as potential solutions. But even more important, it's what we don't see as problems and what we don't see as solutions. So we create the reality of climate change and what it means through our words, through communication. And so how we think about something is shaped by the claims that people make about, in our case, climate change, that we hear. And so media has a lot to do with the claims that we hear, as well as our governmental officials, but also the claims that we accept. So there's some things that we hear that we don't accept, that we say that can't be true. But how we create meaning, how we talk about something, leads us to a reality that determines what we define as a problem and what we define as solutions. And I want to talk a little bit about power. So the ability to make claims and to make your claims heard and repeated is associated with power. And so that power might be what we traditionally think of as authority, right? Somebody who's a governmental official or somebody who's a well-respected scientist. It also might be somebody who has a celebrity following. So who has the power to make claims about climate change? Who has the power to make claims about solutions is something we need to think about as we're trying to figure out how do we communicate clearly to our various audiences about climate change. Also important to think about the ability to prevent something as being defined as a problem is also a form of power. And I'll use an example from the US around smoking. So smoking is defined in the US as an individual problem. People are smokers and they choose to start, they can choose to quit. By defining smoking as an individual problem, this means that the corporations that produce cigarettes have no responsibility. The government has no responsibility. It's only an individual problem. And so the tobacco companies in the US worked really hard to have smoking defined as an individual freedom so that they did not have to address the problem. The reason that social construction is relevant to climate change communication is most of us have indirect experience with climate change. Many of us might see, oh, there's a hurricane, or oh, it's been windy more, or we're having a little bit more extreme weather. But most of our experience with ideas like climate change are indirect. So our direct experience can't inform us. So we get informed by what we hear people talk about. Whether something is considered a problem affects the resources that we put towards it, and more specifically, the resources that we end up not putting towards something. So if it's a global problem, we're not going to put local resources to a global problem. If it's something policymakers are supposed to address, it's not something that individuals are going to work toward. And how we define a problem affects our responsibility and our solutions. So what do we do? One of the suggestions that I have around communicating about climate change is remembering that climate change is inherently local. All the effects of climate change are local. All of the causes of climate change are local. One of the challenges, of course, with climate change is the local causes don't necessarily cause the local effects. So distant causes can affect the local and vice versa. But what that means is it requires local solutions. So if you're in a community that's having an increased storm surge, more flooding, or saltwater intrusion, you need local solutions to deal with that problem rather than global solutions. So we want to frame climate change as really it's a local issue that requires many actors. So we need to be thinking about policymakers at all levels, including government organizations, corporations, non-governmental organizations, communities, and individuals. Each group has actions that they can take to contribute to the whole. And the other thing that I would say, and we'll get more to this when we get towards emotions, but there is hope. Very much the way we talk about climate change is it's this big, scary, global, complicated problem. And that makes people overwhelmed. It makes people not want to address it because it seems so wicked and complicated and challenging. But we need to make sure that when we communicate about climate change, we also communicate about the possibilities, the potentials for solutions, what individual people must do to achieve that hope, to maximize that hope. So very much related to social construction is framing theory. And so framing theory says that an issue can be viewed from a variety of perspectives. And how you view it has implications for the values that are evoked and the thoughts and considerations and the assumptions that come along with that. And briefly, frames are a way of organizing reality, how we define something. And when we promote particular definitions, those are linked to values, which are linked to actions. And I'm going to give you some specifics here. If we think about climate change, some people are motivated to focus on climate change as an environmental issue. That's the way we've typically talked about climate change for the longest time. It's an environmental issue. But it might be more motivating to think about climate change as a health issue. If we frame climate change as a health issue, that brings in all sorts of different actors, right? It brings in our public health community. It brings in our medical community. People start thinking about, oh, this has direct relevance to me and my life and my health. So it brings in individuals. And that kind of a framing affects the solutions that we think about, the problems that we want to tackle related to climate change. Other possible frames are as a national security issue, as a peace issue, as an issue of equality, right? Whether that's global equality in terms of those that are the least polluters are often the people who are facing the most consequences, or whether that's an equality issue more locally, that are most vulnerable in any community are often the people who are most affected. It could also be framed as an economic issue. And so we want to think about, for the audience that we're reaching, for the audience that we want to move, what's the best frame for thinking about climate change, for motivating them? What is it that they care about most? So my communication suggestions are to figure out what's important to your audience. One example that I have seen through my life is before people have children, they very often don't care about something like climate change because they aren't as interested in what's going to happen 50 years from now. Again, that's a problem of how we've framed climate change, because climate change is happening now and it is affecting us now, but people think about it as a distant problem. Other people, when they might not have family, they might be concerned about their quality of life. They might be concerned about achieving their highest potential in a career. What is it that's important to your audience? And that often takes research. Once you do that, connect climate change action to their values by framing the issue. Again, if they're very worried about their health, you might frame it as a health issue. If they're worried about economics and achieving a career potential, frame climate change as an economic issue. So by framing climate change as much broader than an environmental issue, what we end up doing is we get involvement from other sectors. So we get involvement from the health sector, the security sector, education, etc. And one of the things that can be really important, because I know in the US particularly, climate change is a very divisive issue, and framing can bring opposing factions together. They might not agree on the environmental components of climate change, but they might agree on the national security components, or they might agree on the health components. And so framing can actually bring opposing factions together to solve a problem in a way that they hadn't considered before. And so that's what I would encourage you to think about in terms of your framing of climate change. I'll briefly talk about risk communication. So risk communication is how we communicate about what we're going to face as a result of climate change. And we have a challenge. The way experts think about climate change and risk is that risk is the likelihood of an event happening. Again, whether that's an extreme weather event or, the melting of the polar ice caps, by the severity. How bad would it be if it happens? However, lay people think about risk as what's the hazard and how scared or angry am I about this hazard? So that's outrage. So the way a layperson thinks about risk is very different from the way an expert thinks about risk. And this can set us into some traps for risk communication. So my suggestion is to avoid these traps of thinking about risk issues are too complex to communicate well. We can usually break things down. People are very smart. If we can actually break things down into smaller components, then we can communicate risks to people. People often don't want to share risk information with the public because they fear the public will demand unreasonable solutions. That can certainly happen. But when you're presenting risk, you also have to present, here's some possible solutions. This is why something will or won't work. And so you can, through communication, make those demands more reasonable. Oftentimes, people don't want to communicate about risk because they fear loss of control. They fear having to say, I'm not sure what the answer is. Let's figure out the answer together. And that loss of control can be a little bit hard to deal with. But then once you say, let's work together on this, giving up that control gives power to your community and also is more likely to give you reasonable solutions as well as buy-in to your solutions. Some other traps that can happen around risk communication is resenting the public for not trusting the governmental organizations. And this is a challenge in a lot of different countries. And then becoming defensive. It's not our fault, and kind of closing off. But trust is earned, and it's earned through honesty, and it's earned through open communication. And that, again, it can be sometimes hard. Oftentimes, risk communication experts, they focus on the technical risk and ignore people's feelings. They ignore the fear. They ignore the anger that is experienced at having to face a risk that is not their fault, potentially. And so it's important to acknowledge and address that anger or fear. And one of the big ones that happens for risk communicators is thinking if the public only understands the facts, if we give more knowledge, that they'll behave reasonably. And by behaving reasonably, this means coming to the same conclusions that experts come to. And so what we call this is the information deficit model, where we think if we just give enough information to the public, they'll come to the same conclusions that we did. And there is a ton of evidence that shows this does not work. So information is important, but we also have to deal with understanding the layperson's perspective when we communicate about risk. And the last piece that I want to talk about is emotion. And so when we're communicating about climate change, we can use or employ messages that evoke certain emotions. The main way that we have been talking about climate change for the last 3 decades or so, and this is changing recently, has been fear, fear-based. The world is warming, it's going to be awful, there's going to be terrible, horrible, tragic consequences. We're all gonna die, so change your light bulb, which doesn't make any sense. People, when they are afraid, oftentimes, right, you've heard fight or flight. Flight happens a lot. People run away from the issue. Fear can be motivating, it can work, but it also has a lot of negative consequences. A lot of times people want to run away from the fear, or they want to ignore the issue completely, or they become so overwhelmed that they can't take action. Another way we talk about climate change a lot evokes sadness. We're going to lose these wonderful, valuable components of our world, whether that's islands disappearing, whether that's species disappearing, whether that's hurricanes or storm surges affecting farming. So we feel sad about these losses. And usually when we're sad, we don't do anything. We don't want to do anything. We just want to wallow in our sadness. So if we have messages that evoke sadness, we're sort of shooting ourselves in the foot of not leading to action. And what we want to do is lead to action. We can also use guilt. And so guilt is one we have to be careful about, but it can be motivating, but only if there's a clear action to take. So if we make people feel bad about not addressing climate change, we need to have really clear actions for people to take to address that guilt, to feel better from that guilt. And what I would encourage as a more positive way of motivating people is through hope. So hope can be motivating. It generally doesn't have any of the negative consequences that we see with fear or sadness or guilt. It gets people excited and interested about achieving this opportunity, this potentially good future. The only possible caveat is sometimes we need to be careful not to create false hope that will magically solve all the problems with technology, or creating hope that other people will solve the problem so that the person that you're communicating with doesn't have to do anything. So my communication suggestions around hope is always include some sort of solution. When you're talking about climate change, make sure you talk about, here's some things we can do. Here's some potential solutions. We might need to work hard to achieve these solutions. We might need to take certain actions. We might need to all work together, but we've got some possible solutions to create hope. Some messages that create fear and then hope have been shown to be successful. If they just create fear, they're not successful. But if they create fear and then provide some solutions, some hopeful solutions, then they can be effective. But messages that only evoke fear or only evoke guilt are generally not effective. And super important, always, 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 always include specific actions for people to take. There's a lot of messages that exist that say climate change is a problem. click on this link for more information, right? That's not a specific action for somebody to take. You want to make sure you're really clear. Yes, it's a problem, but here's some potential things that your particular audience can do. And maybe you still include, go here for more information, but always include those specific actions because you want people to know what it is that they can do right at the moment where you have their attention, where you have their engagement. And then certainly more information can give them background about how to do the action or why to do the action. But always, always, always in your climate communication, include specific actions for people to take. And now I'm going to turn it over to Azmat to talk more. And so I will stop sharing my screen because I assume you have things in this. Azmat has things there. Yes?
Yes.
All right. So I will stop my sharing. If you want me to continue sharing my screen, I can.
I think perhaps that'd be easier. I'm not quite sure what Zoom is trying to do.
Okay. I will share my screen, and Azmat, just tell me when you want me to move on to the next slide.
Can we do it directly without Zoom?
And not within the Zoom?
Yeah.
And we can. Send Dr. Chadwick
Yeah.
when we see exactly what we're doing.
Yeah.
So I think we're back. So I think she can send it forward.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Chadwick, for the very nice presentation. And I'm very lucky enough to have been among you for the past many days. I'm learning so much from you all. Thank you so much, Dr. Dabelko, for providing this opportunity for me to be here. I will very briefly talk about a few things, and then so that we have time for a questioning session. So I will talk about three things quickly. Communication is voice, and communication asymmetry, and communication is story. Yeah, so this is a very basic communication model that I hope will help us, people talking to each other, using some kind of code like language, visual or textual, to encode what they are going to say, but within a given cultural context, like the social construction that Dr. Chadwick talked about. We construct or negotiate social meaning, drawing on existing cultural repertoire of meaning and signs and symbols. And so there is always the possibility of noise or social distraction, or some kind of ideological or other aspects that hinder our productive communication or constructing socially a social consensus. Okay. Next slide. Okay, I think Sunshine, you are a journalist and you might be familiar with the 5 W's and 1 H. So we communication scholar also use the same who says what to whom and what channel with what effects. So the next slide. Yeah, Communication is voice. Sometimes we think like communication is neutral. It just transmits pre-existing meaning. But just Dr. Chadwick said that no, we use communication to actually socially construct meaning. So at every step of the communication process, meaning is constructed rather than just simply being transmitted to others. So it is not a neutral process. It is a politically fraught process where we take part in assigning or defining those meanings. And so I thought that who speaks, but who is being heard? Sometimes we focus more on the communication, the speaking aspect of it, but not the listening aspect of it. And so listening is equally important as the speaking aspect is. And so communication also gives the agency to human beings to define their matters, to be on the table, to influence policy. And also communication helps us bring our experiences, or communication is already, to a maximum extent, shaped by our own individual unique experiences. So when we have the opportunity to communicate, it also means we have the ability to express what we are experiencing when it comes to climate change. Next slide. Yeah, and so, thank you, Dr. Chadwick. The second thing would be communication, what we call asymmetry. When most of the time there is power involved by virtue of different social roles, expertise, geographic location, where are we? And so some communities or some group of people don't find it equitable to express their opinion. So we call it asymmetry, which is not useful for a co-constructive meaning. And so we constantly need to democratize the realm of communication so that everyone is able to do that. One way to democratize is to use stories. Not only is the oldest form of human communication, stories is as compared to other forms of communication that we have created, like journal articles or memos or news stories. So human stories is kind of, it enables communities to tell coherent stories of themselves and to be able to articulate what they want to say. Narratives and all these. And so stories not only to communicate, but also to listen to others. When we collect data, I'm sure most of you, like us, go into communities to listen to others and then to use the data to construct climate communication. So when we listen to people in the form of stories, like when we ask them, tell me a story of how have you been impacted by communication, it allows them to be more empowering, like it empowers them as compared to other forms of communication. I'm certainly not saying that only the story is the best form, but in most cases, story is the most compelling form of human communication. Next slide. And so finally, I will come to words and then I will conclude. I quote this scholar, Karl Bohler, a German psychologist, that words are the social signals that guide our actions or our behavior. Ultimately, communication is words. Dr. Chadwick talked about framing, but we use words and then we put some kind of frame on the words. And so words do work. They kind of determine what we do or what are we unable to do. They bring things into existence. They are kind of magical things. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so Dr. Chadwick already mentioned, but I will talk about this stuff from practical, from a field. I will quote two studies that I am a participant on. So when we use the word climate change, in the US context, it is, just like Dr. Chadwick said, it is a politically divisive issue. Climate change, unfortunately, is not only a physical phenomenon, but also a political phenomenon. When we use the word climate change or global warming, it triggers certain identity, group belonging, feelings, certain worldviews. people. So when we use a word, it activates a chain of meaning in people, in our brain. And so that chain of meaning is our worldview, how we look at anything. So here, the research shows that typically it is not useful to use the word climate change in the US context. In your countries, for instance, if it is not a politically divisive issue, like in Pakistan, it is not a politically polarizing issue. So we can use the word global climate change. But then change is a neutral sounding word. Like it does not create the urgency to take action. People say change happens all the time. It is a positive thing. So then people use other words like climate crisis or climate, some other words that create urgency. And similarly, global warming shows a kind of direction. People think that the climate, the world is warming. So there should always be heat. But then we also see that there are historically coldest winters. Then people say, where is the warming? Because we just experienced the coldest winter. So it is kind of, it brings some confusion. But we will come to localized meaning because we said people assign very local meanings that relate to their own experiences. The big meanings that usually are constructed in academia or in other elite circles, they are very remote to other communities. They are kind of alienating. So people usually have their own localized meaning. So one study that I am part of, when we mentioned the word climate change or global warming, the people said, okay, so it means you are taking away my gas stove in the US. It means like you will ban gas, the natural gas. Another person says, you are taking away my car, the gasoline car. So this was the localized meaning of climate change for those groups. But when we use other words like alternative words like extreme weather or weather instability, then we have the chance to have a conversation, a productive conversation, instead of closing up the conversation. So for instance, one person said, my basement remains wetter for longer than in the past. Now this is what they practically experience. Another person said, ticks are not dying off early here in the US. So when there are longer summers, the ticks don't die off and they create the Lyme diseases or the vector-borne diseases. But I came across a study in Australia. Because of drought, the ticks die off. So for some people, climate change is a blessing in some small context. For others, it is not. So we have to negotiate those different meanings. And lastly, one person said, seasons don't start on time. So this is what they actually experience, the effects of climate change. So once we attend to these localized meaning, what people actually face, the tangible results, then it allows us to come together and through stories, we can make sense of the climate change, how it is affecting people and what they can do, how they can exercise their agency to affect policy and to see themselves being reflected in what is being done. Thank you so much.
And I'll just leave this last screen up here. I realized it says Azmat Khan. It's Kahkan. I don't know.
I didn't see it. Thank you.
Sorry, yeah, sorry about that, Azmat. But that's both of our emails. So I want to leave that up there for a second. So if you have any interest in contacting us after this wonderful session, you can reach us that way. And then I'll give you a chance to come up with your questions.
So when people feel overwhelmed already, how should we do that? I mean, like, are people already overwhelmed about climate change or the kind of that word? How should we do it?
So I was hearing feedback, but what I think I gathered from the question is that when people are already overwhelmed by climate change, how do we communicate with them? So one of the things that's important is to acknowledge that overwhelmingness. So sometimes just simply saying climate change can sometimes seem overwhelming. However, and that's where I would get to the idea that it's inherently local. Is there an issue? Is there an issue or concern? Can't hear me.
There's some sort of mechanical sound outside, some sort of steam relief kind of overriding it. Hopefully it'll dissipate.
You want me to keep answering? I can't hear what's happening in the room very well. So if you want me to keep answering, give me a thumbs up. Okay. So when people are overwhelmed, I think it's important to say, let's break this down, right? It's sort of like if you think about nutrition, right? There's so many things we need to do to eat well that it could be overwhelming, right? I need to think about my fiber. I need to think about my protein. I need to think about my vitamins. But if you break it down, whether it's nutrition or climate change, you break it down into smaller steps, smaller concepts and say, okay, in my community, what we're most likely to be faced with is flooding, hurricanes, right? What's the thing that we're most likely to face? What are the small steps? Again, you have to think about who your audience is. If you're talking to policymakers, if you're talking to the public, if you're talking to community organizations, what are the small steps that each group can take? And I think one of the components of, I created a whole theory of what it takes to create hope. And one of those things is the notion of possibility. And with climate change, one of the challenges around possibility is this notion that it's this massive global issue. And so one of the ways that we can create this sense of possibility is by, again, saying, here's some small steps, but we're part of a community that's working towards this. We are, whether it's, again, individuals or policymakers or community organizations, we're all working together to address this issue. And this is what each small group is doing. So I think acknowledging the overwhelmingness, breaking it down into smaller bits and pieces and smaller steps, and be really specific about what are the local actions that make a difference and explain how those local actions can make a difference. Does that answer your question? Yeah. I may need questions repeated just so that I can hear them.
I'm a documentary producer. I have some concern. If I want to attract many audience, I have to show the melting glaciers and the dying polar bear and make people domestic and feel fear. But that is the solution. As you told us that solution is the problem, but people don't want sometimes solution because solution is very, very difficult and can impact on people. So when I'm making documentary, that is my concern. Impact the mega drought and heavy flood is the good thing to make documentary. Solution is not good to audience, to attract audience. But what should I do to start?
Yes. So if I'm understanding your question, give me a thumbs up if I'm understanding your question, is when we make, a documentary, right, all the problems are kind of sad and scary. But the solutions are somewhat unpalatable. We don't like the solution. I don't want to have to give up my gas stove or my gas car, as Azmat was talking about. Is that more or less your question? How do we deal with those unpalatable solutions?
Yes, I would like to find solution by documentary. I would like to give them the solution to climate change, but they don't want the solution about climate change. They only want the impact video clip, like the melting glaciers and dying polar bear and sinking land. And that is a big problem.
Yeah, and so I think sometimes the solutions can be hard sometimes, and I think oftentimes if we frame the solutions as progress, right? Nobody got upset about having to get rid of their, I don't even know what to call it, the old phones before we got cell phones, the wall-mounted phones, right? We're not upset about, somebody told us to take away our phones. It's progress, right? We've got these now cell phones. And we went from a lot of people, not everybody, not all countries have gone from, sort of what we call the dumb phone or basic flip phone to a smartphone, right? So we think about these solutions as progress, as, again, particularly if they're technological solutions, these can be new solutions. And so the focus, again, it's about framing. The focus isn't about giving up stuff. We don't want to focus on, you have to give up your gas stove. What we want to focus on, hey, we have something even better, right? So if we give people these hopeful opportunities, we're more interested in those, and we give people hopeful opportunities that allow us to achieve a future outcome that we want, right? Whether that future outcome has anything to do with climate change. That future outcome could be saving money. That future outcome could be healthier air at home. So we don't necessarily always have to connect our solutions to climate change. And so part of that, sort of the more environmental component of climate change. And so that's what I was talking about with the framing in terms of maybe you talk about it as a health issue. Maybe you talk about it as a quality of life issue, and that the various climate solutions are going to improve us health-wise, economic-wise, national security-wise. And so thinking about how those solutions can tap into the things that we most care about. Not everybody cares about polar bears. It's dramatic and it's sad, but I don't see polar bears every day. I have had the pleasure of seeing polar bears in person up in Canada, but for the most part, my everyday life has nothing to do with polar bears. So what we need to do is attach both the problem of climate change to somebody's everyday life, as well as attach those solutions to climate change to my everyday life. So less about the polar bears, but how is climate change affecting my health? How is it affecting there's more, people are having more respiratory diseases. So I'm going to miss work more. That's going to put less money in my pocket. That's going to give me a worse future. And so then the solution is talking about what are the strategies that are going to put more money in my pocket, make me healthier. Again, you have to think about who your audience is and what they care about.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I see a question to my left in the gray suit, white shirt. Yes, you. Yeah, gray suit, white shirt. Yeah. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I just wanted to maybe share a little experience when it comes to communication. I like how you open when you say that maybe research about climate change more in America and Europe. I come from Africa. Now, one experience I've known to be a challenge or mission is trying to identify, can I say, a particular demographic or a particular population. For example, you mentioned about fear and hope. For the fact that probably climate change, is not much prominent in Africa, or let me use the word in Nigeria, where I come from. It's not much prominent there in terms of everybody has understood what climate change is all about. So now, I, as an environmentalist, I already know that most Nigerians are affected by consequences of climate change. Now, let me use one example like flooding. In a situation where there is flooding in the country, particularly in Nigeria, and probably the Meteorological Association, or probably people like us in the advocacy, climate change advocacy, we use whatever platform to sensitize communities about the effect of flooding, or we're expecting 3 days torrential rainfall, and these are going to be the consequences, and people refuse to move. And we suggested what they need to do. Okay, move to so and so place, but they refuse, just because they don't believe in climate change. You see, it becomes a problem. I, as an environmentalist, I want to solve problems. I feel I want to use my experience, my idea to help solve problems, prevent problems, prevent deaths, destruction, and things like that. So unfortunately, the people, the community, because they don't believe in climate change, they have not understood climate change, they refuse to accept my product. So that's the way I talk about this fear. That sometimes the strategy, could be a way of to put fear in them, put fear in them, in order to motivate them or make them, I use what, forced migration, for them to migrate from that area that is prone to flooding, and then probably a hope. The message of hope can be another strategy to maybe alleviate their fears or allay fears that they already have. So I am finding it difficult to marry, how do I say it? It's very difficult for me from a practical point of view. I have seen where it hasn't worked so much unless fear is used as a strategy, which is not very good. But at the end of the day, if I feel it's the only solution available, for what do I do in this situation? So that is where the challenge lies.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I said was fear, then hope can be useful, because the fear can sometimes be motivating, like, oh no, I need to do something. There's a flood coming, or I need to prepare in some way. And I worked a lot with Vietnam around their disaster communication, and they have very, very similar issues to the ones you're talking about in Nigeria, where they might know a flood is coming, and they might be able to warn people that a flood is coming, and people don't leave. If they do leave, they come right back right afterward and live in the same place that might see a flood over and over and over and over again. So what you're dealing with is kind of two issues. One is motivating evacuation. And one of the challenges with motivating evacuation is sometimes it's people don't get the warning. That was one of the challenges in Vietnam. I don't know if it's similar in Nigeria, but there's, some people watch the national television, some people get the radio, but there's remote areas, which are often the ones that are prone to flooding, that literally they have a village leader who goes out with a bullhorn. And so it's kind of hard to warn people who are particularly in rural areas. But when we think about evacuation, we also have to think about, why are people not evacuating? Is it that they don't think it's a problem, which is often one of the reasons. But the other reason is, well, I want to stay with my house. I want to protect my stuff. I want to protect my land. A lot of people are very tied to their home and their place and have often been there for generations. And so the first challenge is figuring out, why are people not leaving? And I'll give you an example in the US. One of the big reasons people don't evacuate is they can't take their pets. They can't take their pets to the areas where you're supposed to evacuate to. So we've started in the US, and it's not fantastic, but talking about like this place you can bring your pets to. And so figuring out, like, that was a problem that didn't make any sense to the scientific experts, right? You're worried about your cats and dogs, like worry about your life, your family. But that was the problem. And so I think one of the challenges is figuring out, why are people not leaving? The second piece that I think I heard you talking about is then people go back, right? This area has been flooded over and over and over and over again, and you keep building there. You rebuild once it disappears. And that's a bigger challenge. Because again, people are really tied to their ancestral land, their families, their place. And so that's one that needs not so much a communication solution, but much more of a government solution that either figures out how can we rebuild in a flood zone in a way that makes these places safer. So what's the structural possibility? Or how can we incentivize having people move to a place that is safer, but gives them the same sense of home and quality that they had in their original place? And so communication can't do everything. And so there are some things that we need more infrastructure kinds of support for. Does that answer your question? Thank you. And I believe the woman next to you had a question as well.
Yes. Thank you for your presentation. Recently, we are focusing on.
I was going to say, I can't hear you very well either. If you could come up or shout or something. Thank you for that. Sorry to not be there in person.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, I was saying recently we are focusing on traditional knowledge as a way to cope with climate change and many issues. So from a communication point of view, how do you think we could gather this traditional knowledge in a way that it could be really faithful, like reliable for finding solutions to climate change?
Yeah, and I think Azmat gave you a hint on that. And I think the best way to gather traditional knowledge is through stories. So there's a lot of people who, particularly people who are in agriculture, who have been, you know, whether you're farming, you've been seeing and dealing with and adjusting to climate change for years. And so one of the ways is to get that traditional knowledge is through stories. And so you can ask people, tell me a story about when this flood hit your community. Tell me a story about what you did when this drought or this heat wave hit your community. And listen to both their definitions of what the problem is, because very often what a community sees as the problem isn't the same as what a scientist or an expert sees as the problem. And so stories are a really great way to hear and listen to a rich cultural context of defining a problem, as well as, okay, so what did you do? And what did you wish you could do? And between what did you do and what do you wish you could do, you will probably come up with a lot of really good community-based solutions. And so then the way you can tell those stories is again through narrative. And so what you can do is take those traditional stories and make stories from the stories, if that makes sense. So make more kind of professionalized stories, but you might have, you know, here's a community leader who's telling that experience. And we didn't talk about success stories, but success stories are also really important, a component of narratives, right? So our community had this, and I don't remember, I want to say it was in Kenya, but I honestly don't remember. There was a community that had a challenge with their water supply as a result of drought. And they had one of their, I mean, it's a small rural village, that one of the community members basically built a windmill in order to help pull the water from farther deeper than they were getting, right? And that's an example of they didn't have any special knowledge or expertise. They didn't have any special resources. And the community came up with a solution. And so telling that story, telling that success story might inspire other communities of, oh, maybe we can come up with a small solution. And so that kind of, it ties in with what I said about the problems are local and the solutions are local. And it also ties in with your question around, we have a lot of knowledge in our communities that we don't always tap into. And whether that's traditional knowledge or just knowledge in our communities that we often don't tap into. And stories as a way of extracting, and I do use the word extracting because we're taking stories from people, but we extract stories from people, but then also returning those stories in success stories or examples or ways that we can solve the problems. Again, on a local solutions to local problems. Did that answer your question? Thank you. Yes, next to that.
Can you hear me?
Okay, yeah, I can hear you okay.
What is your perspective of use social media as an environmentalist to share information related to climate change, for example? Because sometimes, for example, my colleagues, they think it's not a good way to share information because there are a lot of fake news. So use like Instagram, TikTok, or Facebook is not a good way to be serious. So they prefer, for example, share by a note of opinion in a newspaper or something related to research articles, but not social media. But in my case, I think with social media we engage more people. I don't know what is your perspective on that.
Yeah, so I don't remember the exact statistic, but in the United States, it's kind of scary. People under the age of 20 get I think it's between 60 and 70% of their news entirely from social media. TikTok being a large proportion of that. So depending on who you're trying to reach, you're not going to reach young people in this country on traditional media. I don't know the situation in your country, but I'm a big fan of both and. So if you have information that you need to get out, great, put it out in research articles, put it out in traditional media, but also share it on social media. One of the, again, in social media, the only people who see you are those that follow you or might stumble across you. So sometimes you're talking to people who already believe in the things that you believe in. But it can also be a way of connecting with people who aren't using traditional media anymore. And so it depends on who you're trying to reach. And oftentimes, if something is trending on social media, it might then get covered in traditional media. And so social media can actually influence traditional media coverage. Traditional media coverage can influence social media coverage. So I definitely understand the idea that social media isn't serious, but it is. It's a great tool to communicate with people, and you can communicate with people in serious ways, but you can also think about, how can I make this issue interesting? How can I make this issue exciting? Rather than, we get bored. We get bored so easily now, particularly, again, our social media generations. We don't have a long attention span. So as somebody who cares about and is interested in climate change, I'll read a long article on climate change. If I don't really care about climate change, I'm not really interested, you got to get me in like 30 seconds or less and get me to go, oh, that's kind of interesting, right? So a short, what's the key point and why should I care, right? Not why you care, but why should I care? And so that's what social media is really interested in, really good at, is those short, like this is something that's kind of interesting. This is something kind of cool. Like the example that I just said, you know, this, and I don't remember, he was in his 20s. He was a young Kenyan man who just built a windmill to solve his community's problem, right? That's cool. That's interesting, right? We're going to be warming by 1.5 degrees by this year, less interesting. Okay, so you want to think about what you put out on social media has got to be different than what you put out on traditional media. So I need to think about, again, why should my audience care? What's something that's kind of interesting or cool about the issue that's going to get people to start thinking, get people to start thinking about solutions or start thinking about action. Does that address your question?
Can I make a very brief comment?
Yes, please, Azmat.
Do you know that Biden created a TikTok? Yeah, Biden. Yeah. So he knows he knows the power of like young people. And so typically there is some suspicion of young generation, the young part of the population, or emerging technologies. But I think we have to think of these people as a significant part of the population. And also, we just did a study where people said that Facebook was the most empowering medium, not only for communicating, but also for gathering information. Like when there was flood or tornado or something, people shared real-time photos and where help was available and what to do and what not to do. So I think it could be considered as a serious medium. Maybe we just need to have a different approach to social media.
Yeah, and social media can also be really important during a disaster. During a disaster to identify who needs resources, where, what are the problems. That can be really critical for using social media because you get those kind of real-time on the ground individuals reporting and videoing situations in the moment. And I lost the view of the room, but I also know we're past time.
Yeah, we lived a lot of that with the social media when we had our biggest floods, especially because people don't have trust in the government. So there was not enough time notice, you know, for people to evacuate. But also other things happen because people are traumatized and the government were not giving any information for the next storms. You would have posts of people saying, because we have a dam called El Cajon, and it was a lot of rain. So they would say, they're gonna do controlled discharges of the water. And people that were not there were not gonna be any discharges, but that was the news on social media. And people that were not connected to the river, way far away, they were evacuating because of this lack of education, of not knowing where your river comes from, where it's connected. They were moving everything. So specifically with fake news, because fake news sometimes are ill-intended, you know, but some others are just for looking for likes, you know, or just to be famous, people posting. So specifically with fake news, how do you think in social media, especially in this case, is the best form to fight against that? Because that's something that happens. And specifically because of the government, no one's trusting in the government, and because people just rely on social media, not on any other thing.
Yeah, and there's a couple of things about fake news. And yes, it can absolutely have devastating consequences. One of the things, going back to the previous person's question, if you're not on social media, then you can't counter anything, right? If you're stepping back and only letting fake news have a voice, then you don't have a voice. And so one of the things that can be really useful, and it's a challenge, is recognizing and identifying the information. So you may have heard that there's going to be charges going off on the dam, and you might think it's going to affect you in this location. However, and again, it depends if you've got government trust, right? We're we're this organization or we're this government organization. In a lot of communities, community-based organizations have more trust than governmental organizations. So acknowledging the fake news and then, what's that word? English is my native language and I sometimes still struggle. But debunking it, right? Saying this is why it's wrong. And so one of the concerns is if you're not on social media, you're leaving a vacuum for fake news. And so make sure that you're using an organization that's trusted by your community. Again, if the government is not trusted, but an organization like the Red Cross is trusted, or vice versa, if the Red Cross is not trusted and the government is, make sure that's the organization, the trusted organization is the one that's communicating. You do not need to evacuate. The river charges are only going to affect this small community, or there are no river charges, whichever the case may be. Does that help? That answer your question?
Yes, no, absolutely. Thank you so much. So I'm afraid we've hit our time and even run over, but we had a lot of questions for you, Amy, and for you, Azmat. Thank you both very, very much. Perhaps I shouldn't be surprised at all that the people expert in communications have exceedingly well-organized and clear and very practical and helpful presentations, but in fact, they were tremendously so. And so thank you so much for really rich and I think both practical, but also really nested in the theory and the deeper understanding, but then translating that into kind of the practical advice and suggestions and ways forward. Super, super helpful. So won't you join me in thanking Amy and Azmat for today's session? And Dr. Chadwick, feel free to send us materials that you think would be of interest to the fellows. We're gathering that kind of publications from the speakers themselves and the topics that you've addressed. So share those kinds of PDFs with them as follow. But thank you so very much for joining us, Amy. It worked very well, technology and all. So thanks so much and very best.
Thank you all so much. And you had such great questions. And again, my email is just my last name, chadwick@ohio.edu, if you have other questions that we didn't get to. So enjoy the rest of your sessions and thank you so much.
Okay. Terrific. Take care now.
Bye.